Have you ever wondered why some women struggle to trust men? Why some women keep choosing the wrong partners? Why some women constantly seek reassurance, while others push people away before they get hurt? And what if I told you that sometimes the answer has nothing to do with dating? Sometimes it starts much earlier. It starts at home. It starts with family. And sometimes it starts with a father who wasn't there. Because in the Philippines, this story is more common than people think. A father leaves, a father starts another family, a father has to work far away, or a father is physically present but emotionally absent. And the effect doesn't always disappear when someone becomes an adult. Sometimes they follow people into their relationship, into their self-worth, into the way they trust, and into the way they love. So today, I want to talk about something that people casually call daddy issues. But I think the reality is much more deeper than that. Before we start, I want to be careful with this topic because this isn't about blaming fathers. It's not about attacking men. And it's not about judging women. It's about understanding. Because if we don't understand certain patterns come from, we'll keep repeating them. And honestly, I think many people underestimate how much childhood experiences shapes adulthood. We like to believe we are completely independent. We like to believe that every decision we make are completely logical. We like to believe that the past stays in the past. But psychology says something different. The way we trust, the way we communicate, the way we attach, the way we love, a lot of it begins much earlier than we realize. And one of the most important relationships a daughter can have is her relationship with her father. Because for many girls, a father becomes the first example of masculinity, the first example of protection, the first example of consistency, the first example of what love feels like. Or, unfortunately, the first example of abandonment. And that's why I think this conversation matters, because we're not just talking about fathers. We are talking about how childhood experiences shape future relationship. So let's start with the obvious one, the father who leaves. And unfortunately, this happens more often than people want to admit. Sometimes the parents separate, sometimes another woman enters the picture, sometimes a father starts another family, and sometimes he simply disappears. And imagine being a child, you don't understand adult relationship. You don't understand infidelity. You don't understand financial problems. You don't understand incompatibility. You just know one thing: dad isn't here anymore. And children have a tendency to make things personal. They ask questions they never ask out loud. Why wasn't I enough? Did he stop loving me? Did I do something wrong? And those questions can sometimes stay with someone for years, sometimes decades. Because children don't process abandonment the way adults do. Adults can say we weren't compatible, we wanted different things, we grew apart. Children don't think like that. They think emotionally. And when a father leaves, a daughter doesn't just lose a parent. Sometimes she loses stability. Sometimes she loses security. Sometimes she loses the trust. And later in life, that can show up in relationships. Maybe she becomes terrified of people leaving. Maybe she constantly needs reassurance. Maybe she struggles to trust good men. Maybe she becomes overly independent because she learned not to rely on anyone. And maybe the saddest part is that many women don't even realize where those patterns came from because the wound happened years ago and now it feels simply like that it's part of their personality. But what if it's not personality? What if it's pain? What if it's a coping mechanism? What if it's a little girl who learned very early that people lives? This one is very common here in the Philippines because millions of Filipino families experience this. A father leaves the country not because he doesn't love his family. Actually, usually because he does. He leaves to provide. He leaves to earn money. He leaves because opportunities were limited. And many fathers sacrifice tremendously. They miss birthdays, graduations, Christmases, family dinners. They spend years away from the people they love. And I think that's important to acknowledge because many OFW fathers are heroes to their families. But there's another side to this conversation. A child doesn't experience love the same way an adult does. An adult understands sacrifice. A child understands presence. A child understands who's here, who's not, and that's difficult because a father can be providing financially and still be absent emotionally. A father can send money every month and still miss the moments that build connection. The bedtime stories, the conversation, the advice, the emotional support. And eventually, a child can grow up feeling like they know their father without actually knowing him. And that's a strange kind of loss because the father isn't gone, but he's not fully present either. And I think many Filipinos understand exactly what I'm talking about. They grew up seeing their father every once a year, maybe every few years. They love him. He loved them, but there was still distance. I think this one is the least talked about because when people hear father absence, they immediately think a father leaving, a father disappearing, a father abandoning the family. But sometimes the father never leaves. He's right there in the house, at dinner, watching TV, going to work, coming home, physically present, but emotionally absent. And I think this affects more families than people realize because many fathers weren't taught emotional connections. They were taught responsibility. They were taught discipline. They were taught to sacrifice. But nobody taught them emotional intimacy. Nobody taught them to talk about feelings. Nobody taught them to validate emotions. Nobody taught them how to connect. So what happens? A daughter grows up with a father who provides, who worked hard, who fulfilled his obligations, but she never felt emotionally close to him. She never felt understood. She never felt seen. And that's a very different kind of loneliness because at least when someone leaves, you know that they are gone. But when someone is physically there and emotionally unavailable, it becomes confusing. You start questioning yourself. Why he doesn't talk to me? Why he doesn't ask about my life? Why does he seem distant? Why does he seem uncomfortable with emotions? And children naturally internalize those things. They often assume the problem is them. Maybe I'm not lovable enough. And that belief can quietly follow someone into adulthood. They stop expecting emotional connection. They settle for emotional distance because distance feels normal, familiar. And that's the danger. We often mistaken familiarity into healthy. And when we do that, we repeat what we know, not necessarily what we deserve. And I think many women spend years wondering why they always end up with emotionally unavailable men without realizing that emotional unavailability was what love looked like growing up. Not because they wanted that, because it feels familiar. And I think culture plays a role here too. Because if we are being honest, many Filipino men weren't being raised to be emotionally expressive. They were raised to be providers. They were raised to be strong. They were raised to endure hardship. They were raised to sacrifice, and those traits are admirable, truly. But sometimes they came with a hidden cost, because many boys grew up hearing things like, don't cry, be a man, toughen up, stop being emotional. And when you hear that your entire life, you learn something. You learn that emotions are weakness. You learn that vulnerability is dangerous. You learn that love is shown through sacrifice, but not necessarily through words. And then those boys become fathers. And they raise children the only way they know. They provide, they work, they sacrifice. But emotional connection still feels unfamiliar. And this isn't because they are bad fathers. And it's because many of them didn't receive what they are now expected to give. And then something else happens, something much bigger. The pattern becomes normal. And honestly, I think this is one of the biggest problems. When something happens often enough that people stops questioning it, it becomes normal, it becomes expected. And in many communities, people have heard so many stories about absent fathers that nobody is shocked anymore. It's just another story, another family, another child growing up without a father. And that's dangerous because children still feel the impact. Even when adults treat it like it's normal, they still feel the absence, they still feel the disappointment, they still ask questions, they still carry emotional wounds. And maybe that's why this topic matters, because what becomes normal doesn't automatically mean it's healthy. And I think that's something that society sometimes forget. Just because something is common doesn't mean it's harmless. And this is where people usually start using the phrase daddy issues. But what does actually mean? Because if we are being honest, many people use that phrase without actually understanding it. They use it as an adult joke, a label, but I think the reality is much deeper because we're not talking about fathers anymore. We are talking about how childhood experiences shape our adult relationships. And what's interesting is people often assume that father absence creates clinginess, but sometimes it creates the opposite. Sometimes a woman becomes so self-reliant, so independent that she struggles to let anyone help her because somewhere along the way she learned that she can only depend on herself. And that's not weakness. That's survival. But survival strategies don't always create healthy relationships because relationship requires trust, vulnerability, dependence. And those things can feel scary when you have been disappointed before. And here's a thought I've had for a long time. I think many women spend years trying to get from romantic partners the validation they never receive from their fathers. And when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. If a little girl grows up feeling unseen, she may spend years searching for someone who finally validates her. She may spend years searching for someone who finally makes her feel chosen. And I think this deserves its own conversation. Fear of abandonment. Because if someone important lives during childhood, the nervous system remembers. Even years later, even when the person says they are okay, part of them is still waiting for that next person to leave. And that can create behaviors that doesn't make sense on the surface. Some become clingy, some become jealous, some constantly need reassurance, some overthink every text message, every delayed reply, every small change in behavior. Sometimes they are reacting to what happened years ago. And that's why self-awareness is the key. Because once you understand the wound, you stop confusing it with reality. And while we are talking about this, I think we should talk about something that comes up all the time. Why do some women prefer older men? Because let's be honest, a lot of people have strong opinions about this. And usually oversimplifying it. They say things like, oh, she has daddy issues. And that's usually where the conversation ends. But I don't think it's that simple, because there are many reasons why a woman prefers an older man. Sometimes she genuinely prefers maturity. Sometimes she likes stability. Sometimes she appreciates life experiences. Sometimes she wants someone who knows who he is, what he wants. And honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. Not every age gap relationship isn't healthy. Not every woman dating an older man is trying to heal their childhood wounds. Sometimes it's simply preference. But I also think there's another side of this conversation. Because for some women, attraction isn't really about age. It's about what age represents. Safety, consistency, guidance, emotional security, and if those things were missing growing up, it's understandable why someone might be drawn to someone who can provide. Most people aren't sitting there thinking, I didn't get this from my father, so now I'm looking for it in a partner. It usually doesn't work like that. It's much more subtle. We are often attracted to what feels familiar or what it feels like it can feel something we've been missing. And that's why self-awareness is so important. Because there's a huge difference between choosing an older man because he's a good partner and choosing an older man because you are hoping that he'll heal something. And maybe this is where I disagree with the phrase daddy issues. Because if we are being honest, it's not very helpful phrase. It sounds dismissive. It sounds judgmental. It makes people sound broken. When in reality, people are just carrying experiences. Experiences they never choose. Experiences that shape them. Experiences that happen before they are old enough to understand them. And I think that's a very important distinction because there's a big difference between being broken and being wounded. Broken sounds permanent. Wounded sounds healable. Is that a word? Healable. And I believe most people are far more healable than they realize. But healing requires awareness, honesty about what happened, honesty about how it affected us, and honesty about the patterns that we are still carrying today. Because the goal isn't blame, the goal is understanding. And understanding creates freedom. Freedom to not repeat the same pattern. Freedom to choose differently. Freedom to create healthier relationship. And I also want to say something that this topic is not just about daughters, it's also affecting sons. Because when a boy grows up without a father figure, he loses something too. He loses guidance, he loses mentorship, he loses an example of healthy masculinity. And sometimes he spends years trying to figure out what being a man even means. Sometimes he learns from friends, sometimes from social media, sometimes from movies, and sometimes from people who shouldn't be teaching him at all. And that's why healthy fathers matter. Not because fathers are perfect, but because children need examples. But here's the part that gives me hope. Patterns can be broken. Cycles can be end. Just because something happened to you doesn't mean it has to happen through you. And I think that's the most powerful realization a person can have. You can acknowledge the past without becoming trapped by it. You can understand your wounds without becoming your wounds. You can recognize the pattern and you choose different. And honestly, I think that's the bravest thing a person can do. To look honestly at themselves, to look honestly at their family, to look honestly at their childhood. And instead of blaming everyone, you choose healing, you choose growth, you choose awareness, you choose something better, not just for themselves, but for the people that they will love in the future. Many people spend years asking, why am I like this? But a better question might be, what happened to me. Because when we understand the cause, the solution becomes easier to see. And sometimes the answer isn't that you are difficult, you're needy, or broken. Sometimes you're carrying a pain that was never addressed. And this reminds me of something. A quote that stayed with me for a very long time. The child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. Because human beings need love. We need connection. We need to feel belong. We want to feel chosen. We want to feel important to someone. And when those needs aren't met, people spend years looking for it. People spend years trying to find them somewhere else. In relationships, in achievements, in attention, in validation, in success. And sometimes they don't even realize that's what they are searching for. Because the search started long ago when they were still children. And maybe that's why compassion matters, because everyone is carrying a story we usually don't see. A story that helps explain who they become. And understanding that can make us a little bit less judgmental. So, when people ask why do so many Filipinos have daddy issues, I don't think that's the best question. I think the better question is, what happens when a children grows up without a healthy father figure? Because that's the real conversation. And if there's one thing that I want people to take away from this video, it's a long video, it's that your past can explain you, but it doesn't have to define you. A father's absence can explain things, but it doesn't have to determine your future. Anyway, I'm really curious about what you think about this topic. Do you think father absence affects people more than the society realize? Do you think the Philippines talks openly enough about these issues? Comment down below. I genuinely love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. This is the end of this vlog, and I will see you guys again soon. Paalam!